Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and today we have as a guest Sam Tanenhaus, former editor of New York Times Book Review, and more importantly, the author of an incredible new biography, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. He has been working on this biography of Buckley for, I think, maybe 2 decades now, and it has just come out this week. It's an extraordinary book. I don't remember the last time I bought a book in print, but I've bought this one because I want to actually read the whole thing carefully. Obviously, William F. Buckley Jr. is a formative figure in the conservative movement of the last century, of the Reagan coalition that we're now seeing break apart. But I think that the role that Buckley played in building that coalition and that experience and lessons learned from it is so relevant to what's going on the right of center today. So can't recommend the book more highly. Talk about all of that with Sam. Really interesting conversation. Think you'll enjoy it. Also want to make sure, in case you missed it, we had a special bonus podcast episode this week. My conversation with Vice President J.D. Vance from American Compass's 5th anniversary gala, which we held on Tuesday at the National Building Museum in Washington. So be sure to listen to that. I thought certainly a lot of fun, but also a lot of insight into how the Trump administration is thinking, how the vice president is thinking, and some really great advice for younger conservatives as they work to support the development of the new right. So make sure you hear that as well. Forward that around to your friends. You can also find the video of it at our YouTube page. Of course, also have to tell you about what we've got at Commonplace this week, a fascinating mix of stuff on the full range of subjects, from Andrew Hayes and Benjamin Holbrook on Paul Beatty, a Third Circuit judge who could be a great candidate for SCOTUS and bring a lot of the new right thinking to conservative jurisprudence, Fred Bauer on how we can rebuild American manufacturing, and Chris Chmielewski on how the Trump administration can achieve its deportation goals. Of course, Understanding America, always fresh and exciting. Head over to understandingamerica.co. And we're coming up on the end of my enthusiastic reminders that our own new book is out. The New Conservatives. We just released it on Tuesday. It is, I hope, the definitive compendium of the thinking that is driving the conservative movement today and the roadmap to where it's headed. So pick up a copy, or if you think you already know the answer, buy a copy and give it to your confused friend. But without further ado, here is Sam Tanenhaus. And here we are with Sam Tanenhaus. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Oren. Happy to be here.
It is wonderful to see you. It is extraordinary, the book you have written, Buckley, the Life and Revolution That Changed America. It is an immense project you undertook. Are we allowed to call it magisterial?
Allowed, you encouraged, as long as we emphasize that it's also a really good story.
It is an incredible story. It is whatever the opposite of dry. Is it good to have a wet biography? I'm not sure.
Back in Prohibition days, I think maybe it was.
It's a phenomenal book. Of course, your release date and the release date for our book, The New Conservatives, is the same. We're in the same Amazon category, so we are eagerly tracking day to day the matchup. One of us will have to buy the other a steak dinner eventually, I suppose.
Yes.
But we are here to talk about yours. And, I think so much of what Buckley accomplished and stood for is in many ways mirrored in a lot that is happening in American public politics, especially on the right of center today, and kind of how a coalition is constructed, how an ideology is established. And so I think that's an especially interesting sort of topic to delve into. But wanted to kind of start broadly with just, I don't know, how many years did you spend working on this? What did you learn about Buckley?
Well, it's interesting. Or one thing I want to say before we get into that, because you mentioned the parallels with, we'll call it the project going on now. It began with intellectuals. It's really similar to what you and some others are doing now. It's easy to forget that because politics gets overwhelmed by the visceral, emotional matters. But it's interesting to me. We have another Yale guy, as Bill Buckley was, as a vice president now, who has undergone a kind of ideological evolution, we'll call it. But we'll get back to the origins of the book are interesting because I'd finished a biography of Whittaker Chambers It was published in 1997, and I got to know Buckley while I was doing that. He was a gatekeeper. He was the last living person who had really known Chambers. Chambers was the famous anti-communist witness. Well, so that when I started working on the book was 1998, and it was an interesting moment to do it because communism had fallen. That Buckley's great cause had been triumphantly vindicated. And I thought, well, here's an interesting man. Here's a man who won historically. He won the big battle, and yet he was so modest about it. Buckley's we didn't think of as a especially modest person. Not that he was immodest, but he had a kind of glorious sense of self, the way the Kennedys do. The Kennedys and Buckley's similar, very many ways. These big Irish Catholic, wealthy families, New England. But so I began it in 98 is when I signed the contract. And not long after that, it was that Bill Buckley touch. Once you came into his orbit, interesting new things would happen. So suddenly I'm a contributing writer at Vanity Fair, and I have to learn how to write magazine articles, which I'd never done before. And I was working at the New York Times op-ed page, being a journalist, which I'd never done before. And then I got a bigger job as the editor of the New York Times Book Review. And all that time, I'm not a great multitasker. I was not working as hard, certainly not as concentratedly on the book as I began to do once I left the Times and semi-retirement buyout in 2014. And from that period to now is really when the book got written. So what did I learn? Well, one thing I learned, Oren, is what we've all learned. These books are not just about the central figure. They're books I write, which I think of as being not so much conventional biographies as large moral dramas. That sounds so pretentious, but you take a person who intersects with history. That's what I like to do. And for a nebbishy guy like me, to think that an intellectual can have that role is fascinating. So whether it's Whittaker Chambers through his testimony as a witness in the Algiers case, or Bill Buckley building a movement. And so what I learned was he began it almost in childhood. The book includes his first public address, a defense of Charles Lindbergh that is more articulate and better thought out, which he wrote at the age of 14 as a prep school student in Westchester County, New York, than what most adults were capable of. And I realized he was a kind of prodigy. There aren't many intellectual prodigies. We have them in music, we have them in math. We don't really have them in this intellectual world. So I realized that was the story I was telling. I was telling the story of a person in a large family, a middle child, sixth child in a family of 10 siblings, who's competing for attention from the moment he's born. That family has a unique place in their time and in their venue. They're Irish Catholics from the South living on a massive estate in the northwest corner of Connecticut. This will interest you, Oren, because you know the Berkshires so well. When Buckley family began to take me seriously, and their neighbors, is when I learned the term northwest corner of Connecticut. Because even I live in Connecticut now, most people in the state don't know it, but it refers to that piece of the state, which you know very well, very Anglophile in its outlook, its history, all the names, Litchfield, Cornwall, Salisbury. And the Buckleys were growing up as almost as if they're colonizing this corner of America. And that became the theme of the book. How does a man in this family, in this moment, he was born in 1925. His family lived in Europe for several years. English was his third language. That's why he had that unusual accent and loved big words. For older listeners who will remember his television show, Firing Line. In an odd way, he's a little bit outside of the American norm of his time. And yet he was steeped in this older idea of what America's supposed to be. There's almost a kind of restoration to it. I think it will interest listeners to know his first cause was America First, opposed to intervention in World War II, the phrase that has been revived in the new era. So I saw that that's who Buckley was. And to tell the story of Buckley was to tell the story of how a marginal movement of truly conservative, we'd even say reactionary Republicans, took over American politics and reinvented the way we still think and talk about it. So Buckley is the ideological godfather of Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, and I think there's a very interesting conversation to be had about Donald Trump, which I'd be interested to think about and talk about really with anyone who's serious about these things. Let's set aside the name calling and the vitriol. Let's actually try to think through what's going on in the country. And Buckley becomes a very interesting progenitor of a lot of what we've seen.
Yeah, the point about the intellectual prodigy, I think, is so interesting because it so clearly describes him in a way that it describes, like you said, so few people. But what's, I guess, different is, if you have a musical prodigy or an athlete, it's somewhat value neutral. Everyone knows what that person is headed for. It is to be the superstar athlete or the virtuoso performer. There's content to being an intellectual prodigy. And so for someone like Buckley, I think a really important question is, to what extent did he early on know exactly what he was going to use those powers for and what he was trying to build, versus to what extent was he just in the arena and was sort of a factor of the situation around him and channeling those forces together. Do you think you mentioned anti-communism as his sort of core cause? How early on was that his mission, or did he sort of fall into that mission?
That one he fell into, because the first cause was the America First, Lindbergh, American Fortress, stay out of the war ideology, combined with resistance to the New Deal. And it's interesting, as late as in his life, 1958, when Buckley was about to turn 33, he was interviewed by Mike Wallace, very famous broadcast journalist of the time. And he said, "So what are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm a counter-revolutionary." And he said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he says, "Well, a counter-revolutionary is someone who pretty much wants to overturn the view of society," interesting phrase, "that Franklin Roosevelt brought in." And I found that phrase, view of society, resonating for me. He's not just talking about the government. He's talking about an idea of what kind of place America is. And so I think he came into that honestly through his family. His father was a most extraordinary figure. One of my regrets is I had to cut so much material on the early Buckley family history. His father was a lawyer, brilliant lawyer, real estate speculator, and oil speculator who made and lost his first fortune in Mexico. He was from South Texas, spoke not only fluent Spanish, Bill Buckley's father, perfect Spanish. His Spanish was likened to that of a professor of languages in Madrid. That's how good it was. And there you get, or the intellectual and cosmopolitan cultured side of Buckley, which was essential. Also, the belief in education as being the most important area of conflict, something very much alive today. So Buckley was raised with the idea that the fortune his father had made and lost was undone by Bolshevik revolution in Mexico. And the family was raised with that idea. So to be a counter-revolutionary is to restore America to an earlier time. That's where you get Reagan's "Let's make America great again," and Trump's more concise marching orders, "Make America great again." And Buckley really came out of that. And it was called the Old Right. It's confusing because in its day, it was sometimes called the Old Protestant Right, when Buckley was very much a Catholic. And here I add an interesting complication. Because Buckley's parents, his father, W.F. Buckley Sr., came from Duval County in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, less than 100 miles from the Mexican border, surrounded by Tejanos. And his mother, Eloise Steiner Buckley, was of German and Swiss background and grew up in New Orleans. They both came from cultures where the elites were Catholic. That's what set them apart from the classic immigrant stories. They have the Kennedys personified. No Irish need apply. And the Buckleys were very proud of that. They knew the Kennedys and disdained them in that way because they thought they were better Catholics and of a kind of from a higher social caste. So Buckley developed this idea also through writers. Some of your listeners will actually know, like Albert J. Nock, who's the founder of modern libertarian / social Darwinist thought in the early 20th century, whom Buckley as a child met and knew. These figures saw that a class view of America, which is very different from what's happening today. That's Buckley, the older kind of conservative. The anti-communism came once he got to Yale. And his great mentor there, Wilmore Kendall, one of the most original political thinkers of his time, admired by Saul Bellow, the great novelist, Gary Wills, the great historian, all said this is an absolutely first-rate intellect, Wilmore Kendall. Then Buckley met, as he was getting ready to enter the CIA, another genius, James Burnham, who's very big today. Kendall not so much, but I think a lot of our world is very interested in Burnham. A journalist from my era who was very admired, died. I knew him very well, Christopher Hitchens, thought James Burnham was one of the greatest figures of the 20th century intellectual life. He also inspired and then kind of frightened George Orwell. Some of Orwell's most famous writing comes out of Burnham's. And that's an idea that there is an elite, a managerial elite, that's the great phrase Burnham used, that actually controls how the culture works. And the civilization. And the only way to combat that, this is one of my discoveries as I worked on the book, was to create your own counter-elite and counter-argument, what they called war, psychological warfare. And out of that came the militant anti-communism. That's why for a Buckley or Wilmore Kendall or James Burnham, we're talking about people who collectively spoke half a dozen languages, knew the classics. We're not talking about unserious people here. McCarthy was a gateway figure for them because McCarthy was able to touch the masses, to stir them. And those are the terms they use. Half of these people, Buckley's the only one who's not an ex-communist, by the way. All the others are ex-communists, and they've turned. Yeah. And so the idea is that you have to stir the people, the public. How do you do that? You need a figure like McCarthy to do it. And that's where the populism and the high ideology were first brought together. And Buckley learned that on the campus at Yale. And it's quite extraordinary. Look, I know you had a brilliant Ivy League career. When you read about the young Buckley at Yale, though, it's almost unimaginable, isn't it? He's taking on everyone. He sees what all the issues are. He sees what the ideology is. He sees that a liberal groupthink has taken over. And later, everybody admitted he was right. At first, they just called him names.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me about this sort of early period for Buckley, and you see it especially if you look at the sort of manifesto they publish when they launch National Review, that to your point is sort of very counterculture. The irony, of course, is that the culture he is countering, whether we're talking about on Ivy League campus or then more broadly in the sort of mid 1950s to early pre-hippie 1960s, is of course now what we look back on as the consummate conservative sort of kind of culture that you, from this vantage point, would think is exactly what a Buckley was yearning for. Yes. So what was he? was he right then? Was he right now? Do we misunderstand him? What was it that he was rejecting that we now think of as almost the conservative ideal?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I think it baffled a lot of people around him. And if you look at the first issue of National Review, which was published, the cover line is November 19th, 1955, right before Buckley turned 30, or the first issue of the magazine. he begins by saying, an unsigned editorial that's very famous, that's one where he said, "We're standing athwart history, yelling, stop." Right. And the phrase he uses for himself and his allies is radical conservatives. And it almost seems oxymoronic, because if you're a conservative, why are you talking about radicalism? And my friend, my very good friend, Mike Lind, whom I've known forever, I'm pretty sure he's a friend of yours too, brilliant thinker. I think one of the great political thinkers of our time. There's 3 or 4 of them, and one of them is Mike Lind, like a mentor to me, even though I'm younger, said, you can't be a radical conservative. Conservatives conserve. They're not radical. They don't tear things up. Unless you think the dominant culture, which you're right, we see now as a consensus culture. Everybody agreed about anti-communism, and communism. Murray Kempton, who was very much on the left, said the difference between a Joe McCarthy and an Averell Harriman, the patrician in New York, he said, is a matter of taste. They both agree on the big thing. So it's just a matter of, I like the way he says it, but not the way the other guy says it. If you think that culture itself is somehow poisoned at the root, the conformist culture, because that's their term for consensus culture. And so what Buckley did in National Review, you'll remember, is he takes a phrase from the left. The criticism of American culture was that it's conformist. That what we're calling consensus is really people insisting you get in line with whatever that dominant thought is, and say, well, maybe they're using that to silence me, to silence dissent. Buckley, in some ways, is one of the original horseshoe figures, because his early admirers, some of them, were on the far left, and they liked that he attacked the establishment. And I think, and that's our term. National Review invented the expression liberal establishment. It was one of Buckley's mentors, Willy Schlamm, or Austrian ex-communist, who invented the term liberal establishment. If you think of the main dominant culture as an establishment culture, then you start to see who's getting pushed onto the margins, and you start asking why. So for Buckley, it was Catholicism. It's interesting. I had a conversation with Andrew Sullivan the other day, and he knew Buckley. Buckley interviewed him for a job many years ago when Andrew was in his 20s and a phenom at Harvard. And Andrew said when he went to Harvard University in the 80s, he was shocked to hear professors of religion discuss the Bible as a work of literature and not of moral principle and realism. And he was a practicing Catholic. That's what happened to Buckley. So Buckley goes to Yale. He's the biggest big man on campus. He's the last man tapped for bones, which is the highest accolade you could have, because everybody's gathered around to see who's going to be chosen for the secret society. The suspense builds. The last man hasn't been chosen yet. That means he's the king. It's almost like one of those rituals out of Sir James Fraser or something. He's chosen the last man tapped for bones. He's the editor of the newspaper, but probably the most brilliant editor they had, with the possible exception of Henry Luce, who founded the Time Empire, which shows you the league Buckley says. And he looks around and he says, my professors in the classroom are treating Catholicism as if it's some kind of primitive superstition, because they analyze it sociologically. And they make jokes about it. They make jokes about the Eucharist. I researched the Catholic literature of the time when Buckley was shocked by this in 1950. The most original Catholic writer in that period was the great fiction writer Flannery O'Connor. And I have a quote in the book, it's in the endnotes. She can't believe people think she's joking when she says she takes the Eucharist seriously and literally. If you're a believing Catholic, that's the mystery that happens in Mass. And Buckley hears it being ridiculed, so he thinks, okay, to be a part of our establishment now, to hold all the right opinions and believe the right things, is to essentially renounce your own deepest faith. He said Catholicism was more important to him than conservatism. If the two ever came into conflict, he said, conservatism will fall away. He was a Catholic. And it's not taken seriously at Yale University, this great conservative institution that's supposed to be educating Christian gentlemen. So here's the next part, and you get to say something, Oren, which is that the message in God and Man at Yale, and I would maintain, I may be wrong, that's also the message in but a latter day Buckley, Chris Rufo, whom I've never met, but I know his stuff, is saying it's not about bad ideology. It's about unacknowledged orthodoxy and hypocrisy. It's why don't you just say you're a secular liberal? And where Buckley discovered that wasn't being said was because he was the big guy on campus and was taken around to alumni events. He's handsome, he's brilliant, he's incredibly well spoken. He might have been the most articulate person of his time, Buckley. And he notices when they make the pitch to alumni to make donations, similar to today, they're not describing the Yale he knows. They're pretending Yale hasn't changed since it was founded in 1701. That's why his book was a sensation. It was an expose in the classic, what are they teaching your kids? Do you know what goes on in the classroom there? Buckley, the speed writer, he actually learned speed writing because he didn't like to read. He's one of those intellectuals who listens more than he reads. Would write down verbatim what his professor said, and he put it in his book. And it created this quite amazing sensation on the level of what Rufo did with his attacks on critical race theory and DEI in a pre-internet culture, by the way. So everything's done through print. There's barely television at that point. And Buckley does that through print. And that's where he begins this idea that the establishment can be attacked by challenging its relationship to older values. And in retrospect, it gains a lot of richness because we look at, you mentioned the pre-hippie 60s. Well, in the hippie 60s, they made the same argument Buckley did. The institutions are inhumane, they're soulless, Dow Chemical is coming here to create napalm, to drop on villages in Vietnam. Where's the moral soul of the university? Same thing Buckley said. So he was able to be of the moment culturally, while ideologically he was almost a kind of reactionary. And holding those two in balance, nobody before has done it, and no one since.
Yeah, the point about the sort of radical conservatism as something that can make sense at a moment when achieving conservatism kind of requires a radical tearing down of an orthodoxy. Certainly, anyone paying attention to the last decade in American politics will recognize that, and I think that speaks to the through line maybe you were foreshadowing a little bit. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk about the next period in Buckley's life, where he is, so National Review becomes its own establishment of a sort as it builds the movement that even, at least until Trump, we came to think of as American conservatism, as the Republican Party. The political scientists call it Fusionism. It has this very strong anti-communist core. It brings together the free market libertarians, the social conservatives, the Cold War hawks. It was Reagan's three-legged stool. Would you say that Buckley sort of invented it, envisioned it, or simply sort of realized it was happening or made sense and kind of became the instrument for it? I guess to what extent was he describing something that was coming together or normatively willing it into being?
Well, I would say he did both those things, but you're making an important distinction here too, which is that Buckley was not a political philosopher. When he tried once to write a kind of defense of conservatism and was unable to do it. It was called the revolt against the masses. And that's a through line story for him, his inability to do that, because he was really a journalist. There's a term we don't use anymore in the same way because it's been discredited. But in his era, the middle decades, what you call mid-century era, he was what was called a publicist, somebody who presented ideas to the public, but the ideas came from someplace else. And the ingenuity of National Review was at a time when the 6 or 7 most read weekly magazines, which National Review originally was, weekly later became fortnightly in the old term, were liberal. So they had to sound as smart and as clever and as up to date. James Burnham was very big on this. We have to be chic. We have to sound like we're part of the conversation. Well, at that point, what Buckley's doing is listening for great voices in the way editors, the way you do. You're going to have somebody write for you, not necessarily because they know more than everybody else, although that's nice if they do, but because they can communicate it. They can sum it up. They can distill it. Buckley had a genius for apprehending arguments. One of his great professors at Yale, Paul Weiss, quite distinguished philosopher, I loved Buckley. Buckley attacked him in his book, and Weiss loved him anyway. This happened all the time. He could not make enemies as hard as he tried. The only one he was able to make a permanent enemy of was Gore Vidal. Everybody else became his friend. And Weiss said he's very good, Bill is very good at talking about books he hasn't read, which sounds like a put down until you think, well, for a lot of us journalists, we don't always really read the books beginning to end. Walter Lippmann, the great columnist of his era, was once asked to, since he mentioned so many books in his hugely influential column, probably the most influential columnist of his time from about the 1920s to the 1970, said, you mentioned so many books, why don't you each year, one of his editors said, just compile a list of books that readers might want to know. And Lippmann said, it's a problem for me because I've read some of many books. Some SRME, and not the some of them. So Buckley was in the same place where he could pick up an argument with incredible dexterity because he's a debater. So he gets to the kernel of your argument very quickly. And he sees what's interesting about it. So this stuff is going on around him. It was actually Bill Buckley who came up with the term fusionism. It's often applied to another theorist at National Review, Frank Meyer,
right,
who was more of an abstract intellectual. But what's great about Buckley is he comes up with a phrase. Well, phrases and slogans are incredibly important in politics. They're not to be underrated. It's how we understand things is through language. Buckley had an advanced grasp of vocabulary and language. The vocabulary was absurdly huge. It became a kind of national joke. Bill's big words. So he's picked up the strands, the threads of the arguments, and created the place, the forum for them to come together and explore the ideas. Then Buckley can sit back and say, all right, we're free market over here, close to laissez-faire in the classic sense. We want a really militarized battle against the communists. We have to fight them in every continent. We're losing the Cold War. I think my brother Oren is probably one of the very first that just states in the early 1960s, America was actually losing the Cold War. And I realized as I wrote that, no, I don't think I'd ever seen anybody else say it because it was kind of an unsayable thing outside the world of National Review. So Buckley says, what are we doing here? Well, we're creating a fusion of ideas. The ideas fit together. You're doing this now. You're trying to do this now at American Compass. Compact is trying to do it too. Ross Douthat is trying to do it as well. You're trying to take these disparate, what seem like disparate arguments and figure out how they could be fitted together. And so that's what Buckley did. He could tap the voices, and then he could go on stage and debate, and you did it with a couple of notorious, embarrassing exceptions. He would win the debate almost every time. He would study what you said. He'd listen to what you said, find the weakness in it, turn it around, and win a convert. Did all those converts grasp the depths of the philosophy? He didn't always grasp them. His mentors would get exasperated with him. The Burnhams and Kendalls, they'd say, can't you just read a little bit more? Gary Wills, his great protege, said, Bill, why don't you ski less and write more? Because he had all the gifts, he had all the tools, but he used those tools in a different way. So it's very interesting to me to watch how those tools are being used by newer generations. Yeah, you want to know who the thinkers are. You want to know the crux and kernel of the argument. But if you get too deeply involved in them, you're speaking to a very small group. So for Buckley, it was always, how do you shift the tides of opinion? And so it's a different role. And another discovery I made is no one had ever done it before him. He was a kind of performing ideologue and intellectual entrepreneur that's very familiar to you and me. But if you use those terms when he was starting out, when he was reaching his peak in the early 60s, when the Joan Didions and Gary Willses are drawn to him like a magnet, those terms would be meaningless. People wouldn't know what you're talking about. He invented that in and of himself. And that's why he was seen as a great intellectual figure, even if in some ways he was more of a guy who played an intellectual on TV.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's almost he is more a practitioner than a theorist of all of this in a sense, which I guess is often more valuable.
It's how the revolutions get made, going all the way back to Marx. Remember, the people around him are steeped in Marx. And there's a funny line that Bill Rusher had where he said, it's a good thing the Communist Manifesto wasn't better written, or we might have lost Buckley. Because Buckley loved good writing. His favorite writer was Norman Mailer. His favorite columnist was Murray Kempton. They're both on the left. His favorite magazine was The New Yorker. The biggest thrill in his life was when his books began to be excerpted there. So that's the liberal culture again. And yes, a practitioner. Another thing I found is his life, the movement, and the understanding of where the Republican Party was going to be, all that hinged on that one unusual campaign he ran for mayor of New York in 1965. And one of the things I discovered is that what Buckley was unable to do as a theorist, he could do as a spokesman, as a politician. That's when he began to command the respect, by the way, of the political professionals, is they saw what a brilliant campaign he ran and thought, this guy can actually get votes. He could talk to an audience and turn them around. He's an enormous gift. Writing in New York City in the peak 1960s, and Buckley changes the debate, changes the argument, brings in the language we're more familiar with now. And that's the practitioner side. He was a man of action. Yes, he wrote and talked, but those are forms of action if you want to change the world. As Marx said, philosophers have got us, its time has ended for explaining the world. Now you have to change it. And his mentors believe that too. That's why they were all ex-Marxists. They gravitated to Buckley. He's a game changer. He walks into a room. People who don't even understand what he's saying are going to come away from it thinking differently. His most important contribution, one of the people I interviewed, famous speechwriter Ray Price, wrote speeches for Nixon, President Nixon, and had been the awed undergraduate observer of Buckley at Yale. Buckley was part of this GI group who were older than the new kids who came in. So Ray Price was 17 to Buckley's 21 or something. And at that age, that's a big difference. And he said Buckley's biggest contribution was his debate program, Firing Line, which ran from 1966 until 1999. Most of those years on PBS. Buckley was never a conservative who wanted to defund the PBS. He knew that they gave him the platform to reach liberals, because that's what he wanted to do, was go into their living rooms, 100 markets. Very small audience share. It didn't matter. He was reaching the people he wanted to reach. And what Ray Price said to me was, if you were an Upper West Side Manhattan liberal and watched his program, you thought where he would interview/debate somebody, and that introduced a whole wave of talking head programs, Apollo and Cable, all the years. He said, you realize Buckley was smarter than you were. And suddenly, that's what happened when he ran for mayor, too, and the television program came out of the mayoral campaign. As a liberal or progressive, it's intriguing to find the conservative, because of all the prejudice people have, who actually seems smarter than you are. And you think, then your mind is open to persuasion. The one who's playing that role now, of course, is the vice president, which is very interesting to see, because Ross Douthat is getting this about him. I'm feeling, the vice president too. He's figuring out, it's fascinating to watch in real time, with a relatively young man in politics, somebody who is trying to find the language to reach to reach liberals. I would say one more thing about this as we move on. There's quite an interesting psychological profile portrait of Vice President Vance by George Packer in The Atlantic. And one thing I wondered about was, why didn't you talk to Elizabeth Warren and find out about the legislation the two of them worked on together? It all becomes about how could he do it? How could he betray us? And not where's he going? Buckley was very good at looking ahead. And he saw a few steps ahead of him could be the movement he wanted. And you had to go through these earlier stages. Now, for a young man who was always in a hurry and who took Ritalin most of his life because he was so wired, he was able to look ahead, take the longer view, and knew that there were a few steps away, and then they would get to the place where the revolution could happen.
Yeah, the Vance comparison is really interesting because, of course, Vance we now think of him primarily as a political figure in a way that Buckley, notwithstanding his mayoral run, was not. One of the things I find so interesting about the vice president is that he is so recently removed from, in fact, being a writer and an intellectual. I mean, something that I always try to emphasize to journalists is that it's usually somewhat condescending. You say about the politician, like, oh, they actually care about ideas. They actually think about these things in comparison to the ones who don't even do that. Whereas Vance is someone who was an actual sort of part of the vanguard of rethinking these things and, arguing about it at the bar late at night and so forth. And the speed with which he has moved from that to his current role can be a little bit disorienting, but it does leave him uniquely positioned, as you said, to be the one sort of working out, okay, how does this sound? How does this work politically? And one thing we've been struck by at American Compass that I've emphasized a lot is that, certainly in a way, I think distinctive from other folks in the Republican Party, he's sort of providing the proof of concept that, and the Waltz debate, the vice presidential debate was such a fascinating example. Like, look, if you have this set of positions, if you do care about family policy, if you can, speak in these terms and make conservative cases this way, it wins decisively in a lot of respects. And I think that has opened a lot of eyes across the political spectrum to what looks potentially like a very different American politics that is that next couple of steps down the road.
Yeah, Mike Lind told me, because I know he has his own connection to the vice president. I don't know any of the ins and outs of not giving anything away, but I think it's a secret that the vice president admires him. And Mike Lind said, well, this is the best thinker in politics since Senator Patrick Moynihan. And it's interesting, too, because Mike, was in some ways a protege of Moynihan. I knew Moynihan as well, senator from New York, who had begun as an intellectual. Is the issues are the same. It's the family. That was Moynihan's big issue. How do you keep a family together? How do you sustain families? What do we do with families that are not winning the cognitive competition every time? What do we do about that? One thing that bothers me a little bit about some of the discussion of the Harvard admissions controversy and the Supreme Court decision is, which is so much about testing. Who do they think invented those tests? Was it conservatives who invented the SAT? People should read Nicholas Lemon's book, The Big Test, from the year 2000, which is about the creation of what, we call the cognitive elite now. Those were progressives who thought they were going to sift through the culture and find people with high IQs to run it, which is the basis of Bill Buckley's most famous remark, which is people think it's just a joke, but it was actually quite a penetrating observation when in 1960, right when John F. Kennedy won a massive primary victory in New Hampshire, Buckley said, I would sooner be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 faculty members of Harvard. And that was seen as just either a joke or kind of poking the populist bear. But if you go on and read the entire statement, what he says is the ordinary person whose name you choose out of a telephone book doesn't think he's going to solve everything with the theories he's come up with. He's going to look back to older ideas. Well, the 2,000 professors at Harvard, reduced to that smaller number, became mockingly called the best and the brightest a dozen years later by David Halberstam, because they created the Vietnam War as we knew it, which to my mind, I was old enough to actually have a draft number. I was born in 1955. To me, the Vietnam War is still the great trauma that shaped our politics. It's interesting, our three of our recent presidents, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, were all born each 1 month apart in the year 1946, which was the year the draft was instituted and student deferments ended. They all came out of that same moment. One was born in June, one July, one August. And those were still, those are three of our powerful leaders in the last generation. That's a shaping incident, event. And Buckley, in his own way, saw it through a conservative interpretation. Interesting with Vance, too. Yes, he has his time in Iraq. Yes, he has his time in the Ivy League. But this idea that, yes, you begin with the arguments. Even George Packer says, J.D. Vance was a really good writer. He's not just a guy who wrote a successful memoir. I encountered him once. We did a remote radio broadcast together. I forget why I was on, but it was after I'd left the Times. It was all done. It was pre-COVID, but still remote. It was a program in Los Angeles, and J.D. Vance was on it, and I was on it. And when we had a free exchange, he said to me, "Oh, why don't you tell your old friends at the New York Times Book Review," I used to be the editor, "why don't you tell your friends at the Book Review to write a big review of my book?" It was already on the bestseller list. But that's who he was back then, And that's when he had all those brilliant observations. I still remember and repeat one of them. I'm going to mention it now because I think it tells us something about politics. And at that point, J.D. Vance was a kind of, center-right Republican guy, as we know. He was not a movement guy. And so the host, and I forget his name, feel bad about this, but he said to Vance, he said, "Well, you write about Ohio and you write about the Midwest. Don't Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both kind of come from the Midwest? Don't they have that background? Why should there be so much hostility?" And what Vance said was, they got away. They were the ones who came from the Midwest, went to the fancy elite colleges, and started speaking differently once they did it. And that's what you remember back home. They don't sound like us anymore. That's a very authentic, real thing. My late father-in-law was Italian-American, and kind of a complicated family history. But if you grew up in certain neighborhoods, you're not supposed to go to college. Same thing we hear about the inner city now. You're not supposed to talk like that. You sell out when you do that. And J.D. Vance, I think, is the first major politician in our time who really grasps all of that in a visceral, authentic way. The words you use, the vocabulary, where you're comfortable and where you're not, say something about who you are in a culture, a society, ours, which does not like to talk about class, even though it's everywhere present. Your group, I'm going to give some credit to Yuval and Ramesh and Mike Strain, all those guys I wrote about way back when in the Times Magazine, for some who remember when the big term was reformicons, the reform conservatives. They were also grasping this idea that there was a hollowed out center. But they did see that. And they had to have family policy. I remember Ramesh Pranur telling me, we had lunch with some of them so I could interview them. And he said, I really respect those Democratic Congress people who were willing to lose their jobs to support Obamacare. He said they were willing to go back home and get thrown out of office because they thought this was the right thing to do. And that was it. And it to help their constituents, even if their constituents didn't get it. So it's interesting to me to watch, I do not want to overgeneralize, but to watch where things are going now in that corner of the universe, let's say you're coming from, Well, you have to stitch these things together too. Where you have a popular or popularist or populist, whatever people want to call it. You have a family or community-centered idea about what government should do and what politics should do, and you have a vocabulary that is hard sometimes to deploy if you're not coming from the left. That's why I wanted George Packer to talk to Elizabeth Warren. Sit her down and say, okay, so you and J.D. Vance are working on this. What was he like? What did you talk about? We never hear that. To me, that's part of the conspiracy of silence that still dominates a lot of our journalism. And that my book is actually partly about is how Buckley developed a whole argument about conspiracies of silence.
Yeah.
That I think drives much of journalism today.
I mean, it is fascinating how many parallels there are. I think for our listeners are overwhelmingly folks who are themselves engaged in this project of how does this all look this time around, and it is page after page of recognition, at least for me, of the history repeats itself. This is how it looked last time around. How is it playing out this time? What is the same? What is different? So I highly recommend everybody picking it up. It is Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. Sam Tanenhaus, thank you so much for coming and talking with us about it.
My pleasure, Oren. Great talking with you.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.